In the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of discussion about the land. The promise is given to the patriarchs for a land. And the New Testament also picks up on this worldview and talks about the promise to Abraham that he would inherit the world. But how do we understand these promises in the Old Testament and the New Testament? And how should we think about some of the difficult applications of these when it comes to the way that Christians today relate to these promises of the land in the Old Testament? Joining me today to discuss this is Greg Beale. You may know him as G.K. Beale, who has written a lot on the temple and has recently written a short article on how to understand the land promises in the Old Testament. So we're going to discuss that today. So Greg, welcome to the channel.
Glad to be here.
Well, let's jump right in here. Maybe you could say something at the outset about what do we mean by land promises in the Old Testament? Who received these promises and what were they about?
Well, when we think of the land promises in the Old Testament, we think about the promise of the land to the patriarchs and Israel coming out of Egypt, and God promising that he would give them a land to dwell in. Those land promises, however, have their root in Genesis 1 through 2, where Adam is seen to be a priest, and he's dwelling in a sanctuary, and that's the place. It's a garden sanctuary, and that's the place where the cultivated land is. Outside of that is the uninhabited land. And so Adam's task was to rule and subdue, as we think about Genesis 1:28, to rule and subdue, to multiply, increase, and fill, and rule over the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field, whatever swims, the fish of the sea, and to fill the earth. And that's not just to fill the earth with humans, but to fill the earth with humans who are in the image of God, hence reflecting the image of God. Hence, the task is to, if he's to fill the earth, he's got to go out from the garden to expand the garden, expand the presence of the garden, the cultivated land of the garden. And when you begin to have children, sometimes you have to add on to your house. So the garden sanctuary was to be expanded. And really the commission was to expand until it filled the earth. As Genesis 1:28 says, that was his task, to fill the earth with image bearers who glorify him. So to fill the earth with the image of God, but to expand the land from that little mountaintop there in Eden, as Ezekiel 28 refers to, until it fills the whole earth. And so when Adam does not do that, the commission then devolves onto Noah. He's given the commission. Genesis 1:20, he doesn't do it. It's given to the patriarchs. And with the patriarchs, you, for the first time, get a promise mixed with command. And so the promise is one will come who will fill this, though the patriarchs are not able to do so. And yet, when the promises are made to the patriarchs, it's very clear that this idea of filling the earth is still in mind. For example, even later in Isaiah, it says, God, you've increased the nation. You've increased the nation. You have extended all the borders of the land. That's speaking of a final end time promise. You've extended all the borders of the land. Yeah, that is, you've extended them worldwide. And very similarly, in Isaiah 27, the beginning of the chapter, it speaks of Israel being portrayed as a vineyard, and then it says that in the end time, Israel will take root, will blossom and sprout. You know, notice the garden language. and fill the face of the earth with fruit. So this echoes be fruitful and fill the earth, Genesis 1:28. And then in the actual patriarchal promises, Genesis 28:14 says to Jacob, your seed will be like the dust of the earth. You'll spread out to the west, east, north, south. In you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And Genesis 26:3-4 speaks of all the earth being all these lands. You will inherit all these lands. And it's not just the lands that were promised by God, that were the formal land promises to Israel that they were to possess, but it's all the lands where the people are who are to be blessed. And so I could go on, but the point is that the land promises were not something limited just to the borders of Israel's land, but those borders, as some of the texts say, were to be expanded. And the Israelites were to spread out until all of the borders of Israel extended to the ends of the earth. And thus they were a corporate Adam, just as Adam should have done that. They were a corporate Adam. That's why they're called the Son of God. In Exodus chapter 4, Adam was a son of God, as we know from the end of Luke 2, and conceptually in Genesis 1. And so the idea then is that that land was to extend to the whole earth. So when we come to the New Testament, it makes sense that Romans 4:13 says, for the promise to Abraham or as to his seed would be that he would be heir of the world. That word heir is the word used for Israel inheriting the land, but now it's not just the land, it is the world that Abraham is seen to be inheriting. And so when we get to the New Testament, we find that in Christ we have an inheritance, that the Spirit is an inheritance. And the reason for that is those land promises have begun to be fulfilled. Remember that the real estate in the Old Testament included the throne of David. It included the temple. And so now Christ is that temple. Christ is on the throne, Acts chapter 2 says. And so there's some real estate that Christ is occupying. And not only that, his resurrection body is the beginning of the material new creation. And so he's the beginning of the inheritance. And when we identify with him, come into union with him, we begin to experience that inheritance that was promised to the patriarchs, ultimately that Adam should have experienced. And we are to enjoy that inheritance. And the book of Revelation finally shows in chapter 21, the last vision of the book, that the whole new heavens and earth are pictured as the Garden of Eden. That's one of the things it's pictured as, which makes sense because the Garden of Eden originally was to expand and cover the whole heavens and earth. And so we might now ask, well, how does that relate to the issues of Israel's land today? Many Christians do believe that Israel's beginning to fulfill the promises of the patriarchs, of the land promises. I, for myself, don't think that what's going on in Israel has anything to do with those promises. Those promises began to be fulfilled in Christ, and it was his task to expand the earth as the last Adam. That's why one reason he's called last Adam. And so that begins to happen in Christ. It's finally consummated at his last coming when all that land is expanded throughout the earth. He does that in the new heavens and earth. And so that hence beginning fulfillment in Christ and his people, it is not fulfilled in physical ethnic Israel, except those who are ethnic Israelites who are Christians and are in Christ. So what is going on in Israel is definitely in God's plan. There's no doubt about that. but it's not in God's biblical prophesied plan. The prophecies of the land are fulfilled in Christ and his people. So we need to be careful about saying that physical unbelieving Israel is the apple of God's eye. No, Jesus is the apple of God's eye, and those in Christ. And that's where the focus of the land promises are. In the discourse in Matthew, Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says that the meek will inherit the earth. That's from Psalm 37, which is speaking of Israelites inheriting the land. But now Jesus is expanding that. He's not talking about Israel's land anymore. He's talking about the earth. And so that makes sense in light of that. So I don't know if you want to ask some questions. That's sort of a very brief, exceedingly brief sketch of my understanding of the land promises. You can see it does have something to do with the temple. We can talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, so that's helpful. You've got a theology whereby the land is not just a small area of land, but it's designed to grow and spread and fill the whole earth. Maybe you could say another word about the hermeneutic behind that and the way that the Old Testament relates to the New Testament and the people of God from the Old to the New Testament. Because the way you're describing the land promises, doesn't that entail a particular way of understanding the way that prophecy works and the way that the New Testament fulfills the Old Testament?
Well, I think what you have is a very, some people think that this is kind of a figurative or an allegorical way of interpreting, i.e. hermeneutic. And actually, what I've shown is that in Genesis 1 through 2 and in the patriarchal land promises, it is a literal, straightforward issue that the land is to be expanded not just to the borders, the formal borders of Israel's land, but to all the earth. So that is not, and we see that in the New Testament, that's the way it's interpreted in Romans 4, and I think in Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere, Book of Revelation as well, chapter 21. So I don't think, I think when you start getting this universalization of the land in the New Testament, that's just carrying forth the literal hermeneutic. And it's still literal. Christ is now the last Adam. He is to do this. And now it's a little bit unexpected that his resurrection is the beginning of the land inheritance. That's a little unexpected. But we have enough seeds in the Old Testament about the universalization of the land and that the last Adam was to do it. Of course, we're going to have a little bit of unexpectedness, but ultimately, that beginning in Christ is expanded in a very literal way to all the land, so that God's presence fills all the earth, according to the Book of Revelation, and that's what it was intended to do with the initial task under Adam. So I take it as a pretty straightforward literal hermeneutic, and I don't think the charge of allegorization or of being too figurative applies to my analysis.
Yeah, that's helpful, Greg. So maybe just to wrap this conversation up, just to try to summarize what we've said, if somebody were to ask you, what does Jesus mean when he says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth"? How does that relate to this question we're talking about?
Well, I actually mentioned that very briefly. I think what it means is that those who are humble of spirit, ultimately true believers in Christ, will inherit the whole heavens and earth in Christ. That's as straightforward as it is.
All right. Thank you, Greg. That's all the time we have for this episode. This has been an overview of how to understand the land promises of the New Testament. So thanks, Greg, for joining us in this episode. And
you might mention my article in the Gospel Coalition. There's an article on Israel's land promises in the Gospel Coalition, posted together with an article by Darrell Bach and another theologian who disagree with me on that issue. So if you want to look at different perspectives, you can look at that.
And I can leave some links to those articles in the notes to the episode so people can track those down and see a fuller explanation of your position and compare it to the other ones as well. So thank you for joining us for this discussion of biblical theology. And remember to keep it clear and focus on Christ.